Hello, American Studies students. We will be talking about the African American struggle today. The time period that we're covering is primarily the 1920s, but it will bleed into a little bit of the 1930s and 40s, and even we'll talk about a little bit of the 1910s that leads to what happens in the 1920s. But the early 1900s, what African Americans' image was struggling, why and how there was a fight to change that image. So the film A Birth of a Nation comes out in 1915. This film portrays Black Americans in a very negative and terrifying light. So in this image from the film, you see white actors in blackface pretending to be Black people in Congress and the dangers of having a Black congressman or all Black Congress, how they could be corrupted. And here in this picture you see one of the actors drinking alcohol and acting drunk in Congress. So basically just depicting them as this negative image, and the dangers of giving them these positions of power. This film is supposed to be of post-Civil War, the very end of the Civil War era. It's showing, the dangers of what powerful Black Americans could be. Here's another image of another white actor in blackface. He is assaulting this white woman. She ends up throwing herself off a cliff in the film in order to escape the harassment of this supposed to be Black man. But again, this film is supposed to depict Black Americans as very negative and show, it's there as a warning against what could happen if these Black Americans gain power, these Black militias at the end of the Civil War, what danger they presented. In the film, the KKK is actually the hero. So the villain is these white actors in blackface, and the heroes are the KKK. Here's a picture of the cover of the film. So you see the KKK almost as a knightly image. They look like knights in shining armor in the film. The KKK did exist before this film, near the end of the Civil War, but they ended up fading out over time. They lost a lot of members and power over time. And after this film came out in 1915, they really regained power. It kind of gave a new birth to the KKK. Here's a picture of the real KKK marching in Washington. You can tell their outfits and their appearance looks very similar to the heroic appearance shown in this film. The film also was a huge success, if not the most popular film of that decade. Definitely one of the most popular films of the decade. It was watched in the White House by the President Woodrow Wilson at the time. It was seen as this wonderful depiction of history at the end of Civil War, even though really it showed African Americans as dangerous and corruptible and all these other negative things that were stereotypes presented. So through the film, powerful hatred began to rise. The KKK began to become more powerful. It also encouraged anti-immigration post-World War I. So after the war, these movements that wanted to put quotas on how many immigrants could come into the U.S. started to be pushed by groups like the KKK. They're estimated about 3 million to 8 million KKK members by the mid-1920s, so a huge increase in KKK. It went from basically nothing to a powerful group in the United States. They also started to gain local and state political power, so they not only were an organization fighting for these things, but politically were fighting for these things as well. By 1924, 40% were in 3 states, Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. And I think a lot of people think of the KKK as a Southern problem, but as you can see based on this number, it was a problem all over the country, but definitely in the Midwest and in Indiana, our home state as well. So the KKK begins to rise, this hatred against Black Americans begins to rise, and this fight for white supremacy becomes a new movement in the 1920s. And we saw this with Prohibition. The KKK really fought for Prohibition. They wanted the ban of alcohol because they saw African Americans as users and abusers of alcohol. As you can see from this picture, an African American being drunk in the film, that image of the criminal being drunk, that was portrayed in that film, an image being portrayed of Black Americans, and the KKK used that image in their fight for white supremacy. Here is a picture of Tulsa. Tulsa was a very prosperous Black community in Oklahoma. If you guys remember the Homestead Act and remember exodusters, Oklahoma and Kansas were two main states where a lot of these exodusters migrated to. Tulsa was a very prosperous Black community. It was even called Black Wall Street because of the success of this community. Hatred for and the KKK, this rise of power, this fear of Black people being wealthy and powerful was growing in the 1920s. And so in 1921, Tulsa experienced this hatred head on. The town was burned down. It's called the Tulsa Massacre because people ended up dying. And they basically destroyed this beautiful, prosperous Black community. Here's a quote about the Tulsa Massacre. So, for fully 48 hours, the fires raged and burned everything in its path, and it left nothing but ashes and burned safes and trunks and the like where once stood beautiful homes and beautiful houses. And so proud, rich Black Tulsa was destroyed by fire. That is its buildings and property, but its spirit was neither killed nor daunted. So this quote is saying that the fire raged and burned, burning this beautiful town down. And while the property was burnt, the spirit of the community was not. So a little bit of optimism. But Black Wall Street, this prosperous town, experienced this horrible event in June 1921. So a violent episode nearly destroyed the entire Greenwood area and left hundreds dead. A mob formed after a 19-year-old Dick Ronland, a Black shoe shiner, was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white elevator operator. So there are multiple stories about what happened. The sum of the story is that the elevator was crowded and this young Black boy accidentally either tripped on her, either stepped on her foot or hit her arm. He accidentally touched her in some way because of the crowded elevator. But to the people hearing this story, it was told as a Black boy assaulted a young white woman. And so riots started to explode while they were trying to decide what they were going to do about this incident. Rioters waited outside the government building and then started to protest, killing people, burning and looting stores and homes. Numerous eyewitnesses describes airplanes carrying white assailants who fired rifles, dropping firebombs on buildings, homes, and fleeing families. So it was not only people protesting outside of a government building about this assault, but turns into this massive destruction of people burning down homes, shots fired. You even see airplanes coming in, raining down bullets or other kinds of weaponry. So you see this almost war-like scene. It looks like warfare. But it was just this town being attacked by this angry mob. Law enforcement saw this as an uprising of the townspeople and took a long time for anyone to really stop these rioters. So why did this happen? If you want to read this quote, you can, but basically it was economic. So the town was wealthy, the community was wealthy and prosperous and successful. A lot of the all-white communities around Tulsa were very poor, and so they saw this town as a problem. They saw it as competition and something that was dangerous. This wealthy, powerful town of all Black residents was something that was dangerous in a lot of these white mobs' eyes. So they use the assault of the alleged stepping on her foot or hitting her in the elevator as kind of the catalyst for them attacking this white community or this all black community that they've had eyes on for a while. The outcome, it was not until noon the next day that Oklahoma National Guards tried to take control of the situation. About 10,000 black people were left homeless, and property damage was estimated about 2 million, which is equivalent to 32 million in 2019. So significant financial damage, people losing their homes, some people losing their lives, and definitely a significant event that almost destroyed this prosperous black community because of the prejudice that existed during this time. Here is an image. It says, all that was left of his home because of the Tulsa race riots. You just see everything around him is completely destroyed. Here is another image, a photo taken showing an elementary school completely destroyed after these riots. Here's a young boy with the image of destruction behind him, people picking up, trying to take anything that remains from this destruction. The black people of this community were ordered to carry green cards with them because a lot of people blamed the black community, the black residents of Tulsa, for this riot. They did not blame the white rioters. They did not blame the white mob that was attacking the community. They had blamed the residents. So they had to carry green cards, to make sure this didn't happen again. So the blame was never put on the actual assailants. It was put on the community that was in ruins. So you see this image from The Birth of a Nation, and you see one of the outcomes of that image, that how dangerous it is for a black community to be powerful, and what the result can be. Tulsa is a great example of how this hate can turn into something so ugly and dark. So African Americans in the 1920s didn't just sit back and let this image take over and let these things happen without a fight. African American communities during the 1920s chose to resist, but they chose to resist through music, through artwork, through writing, through film, through some kind of media. They wanted to represent their community, African American community, as something different than what The Birth of a Nation showed them as. So the Harlem Renaissance was a cultural revolution filled with writing and artwork and music. Think of jazz music, think of different poems we will look through for the rest of this class. The artwork allowed the black community to gain civil and political rights because it drew attention to the issues, it drew attention to the reality of the community, the struggle of the community, the value these communities had. So bringing attention can bring about real change. And it also was a way to show the culture of the oppression they were feeling. This is also paired with a great migration, so a lot of African Americans were leaving the South, leaving Jim Crow, and going to urban centers like Harlem. You have people going to Chicago. Major cities are getting these floods of African Americans from the South, and they're bringing their culture with them, bringing their music, bringing their artwork with them as well. Here's an image of the Great Migration. So you see people leaving the South for California, Minneapolis, Chicago, New York. So these major cities were getting a huge influx of African American migrants. That is all. There is also music and literature that you need to go through. So go through the music and go through the literature assignment. Complete those about the Harlem Renaissance, about this explosion of culture, and that is what you will have to complete for week 3, day 2. Have a great day, you guys.